Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Laurent Carbonneau with us tonight. He is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. We're going to talk a little bit more about who he is and what he does in a minute, but I got to tell you, he wrote a really interesting piece about these mandate letters. As you know, last week, the cabinet was sworn in, and then the prime minister sent out these mandate letters. And previously, these mandate letters were specific to every different minister. This time, there was one mandate letter for everybody. And Laurent thinks it's a good idea. And so I thought it'd be great to check in with him to see what he's all about, why he thinks this. Welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on, Brian.
My pleasure. So why did you write this post? You previously been associated with the NDP. You're in charge of policy at an organization that's all about innovation. Why write something that's positive about Mark Carney's mandate letters?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom all the time. We do our fair share, but I do think, broadly speaking, and I'll get a little into the weeds here. And for context for your listeners, I used to work on Parliament Hill. I'm a real, government nerd, so this is stuff I think about a lot. The last government really struggled on priorities, and if you looked at the mandate letters they put out, and I should add as well that the Wynne government in Ontario and the Trudeau government federally are the first governments in Canada to publish their mandate letters for public consumption. Historically, mandate letters have been, between the minister and the prime minister. They're very confidential and have usually been treated as such. In fact, I know the Ford government has gotten into some spats with media about this. So, it may very well be that they're sending out, individualized mandate letters as well. But for the purposes of the public conversation, I think it's a nice change of pace to say, here are some really high level priorities. Here's the objectives of the government. Now go do your job, right? Rather than saying, here's all the exhaustive things I'd like accomplished, which, I think I can see a model where that's okay. But I did think that, in the last couple of years, we've seen a pretty distracted government that has struggled to really follow through on priorities.
And that this would focus everyone. Is that what you're
exactly.
Arguing? Now, why don't you, if you could, because you actually repeated them in your post, why didn't you tell us? Because you think that a lot of these things are actually similar to things that your Council of Canadian Innovators would like. What were they specifically?
Yeah, sure. So to kind of put this in context a little bit, a couple of weeks ago, we put out a mandate to innovate, which is a pretty big policy report. We have, 34 recommendations across 14 different departments, and really recognizing that Canada's economic situation is an emergency, right? And that you can't really have a strong, secure Canada that's innovative and prosperous if you don't, get that prosperity piece right. So looking at that mandate letter, starting off the top, recognizing that our weak productivity compared to other countries is a huge risk to Canada, I think is exactly the right framing. And then looking and saying, okay, well, we need to strengthen our trade and security relationships. We need to create a defense industrial policy, reinvest in our security, investing in making Canada's economy more integrated and competitive, and making Canada a destination for top talent. All of those priorities were stuff that we called for and highlighted. So in that sense, I think you get those five ingredients right. It's not everything, but it's a lot of our big problems, and it's really encouraging to see them focused on that.
You started out by saying Canada's economic situation is an emergency. Do you really think that? An emergency?
I do, and I'm not the only one to say it. Famously last year, we had a deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Wilkins, who said that in a much quoted speech that it's a break the glass moment on productivity and our economic gap with the U.S. I think put that into more context in the innovation economy that we live in now. What really matters is, do you own and control, foundational intellectual property and intangible assets, the types of things that make companies really, really successful today. And if you don't, you're not going to have the kinds of big companies that really lead global growth. So if you look at the US for the last 20 years, a lot of their growth is coming from a pretty small number of companies that are, really, really over and beyond productive and profitable. And that's come with some costs for them. And I don't want to just elide that. But it is really the case in today's economy that you need to have these big successful companies, and our council represents about 170 of Canada's scale up technology intensive companies. And it's our view, and I think one based very strongly in economic research and evidence, that we need to actually have more big successful companies in this country. And if you look at the success in past generations of companies like Nortel, of BlackBerry, they really coincide with a period when Canada was doing really well and attracting a lot of investment in people.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. It seems like Donald Trump, the president of the United States, wants to not focus on those innovative companies that you're just talking about, but it's on bringing back to the United States manufacturing, and car manufacturing is something he talks about quite a bit. Those are the tariffs, and he's putting huge tariffs on China, such that consumer products will be brought back to manufacturing in the United States, and even in Canada, we're talking about oil and gas, car manufacturing, aluminum. Is it manufacturing that's the key to the economy, or is it these innovative companies and intellectual property that you're talking about? I'm trying
So
to
in my
a little
view,
bit.
it's a bit of both. I think you highlighted tariffs. I think one really important piece here is that, when we talk about the uncertainty around tariffs, it's much harder to tariff services, right? And if you're a company that exports services, it's not impossible that you're going to be caught up in these things, but it's more difficult. And historically, that's just not been how, the global trade regime works. So there's some security kind of baked in there. On the manufacturing piece, I think there's a strong tie between manufacturing and innovation. And a lot of, we have companies who make semiconductors, we have companies in other, medical devices, in this kind of hardware space. And that is important. I think the big difference in the US right now is it's a bit of a confused policy where they're saying, we're going to bring back making iPhones, we're going to bring back making clothes. And there is some value in really high-end manufacturing, like precision engineering stuff is like there is real value there. And we had a big conversation a couple of years ago about semiconductors and the sort of security situation in Taiwan, making us kind of very, very reliant on a very tricky geopolitical area. But this is not the case with clothes made in Bangladesh or iPhones assembled in India and China. This is pretty low value work, and to an extent to which I don't think we want to emulate that policy. We do want to preserve advanced manufacturing in Canada, but the kind of stuff that President Trump is on about, I think, is not exactly where we want to go.
So, do you think that we're going to be able to have a strategy that's going to have greater technology being developed in Canada, companies that are innovative being grown and strengthened, and be prosperous in Canada with these types of strategies that the federal government is now focused on?
Yeah, I would certainly hope so. And I think they're saying the right things early on. In our view, there's kind of four things that companies need to sort of, go beyond the startup phase and into the space where they can really be global competitors. And it's having the right talent in place, so the right people, having capital, so just access to strong competitive capital markets where they can go fundraise if they need to, as well as, competitive tax regime. One thing that we're a little outside of the ordinary on this is saying access to customers. So not just global markets, which is I think really important, but also government itself being a much better customer of innovators than they are now, I think is a really important piece of this. And the last piece is regulation and pieces around, our IP strategy nationally. If you have all of those ingredients, I think we can make a real difference. And you brought up energy in your last question. And I think that's a really important piece of this too, is Canada has these really, really strong cornerstone industries, right? We have energy, we have agriculture, natural resources. Like these are all places where I think we can be more innovative just in those places too, right? Like it's not just software, it's not just manufacturing. How can we kind of upgrade our forest products? And you look at Sweden and Finland, who are countries historically that have had really strong forestry sectors, and they still do. But now Sweden's forestry sector, you best know as IKEA, right? Like they've built this global brand around something that people really want to buy, and they export like crazy. So this is kind of places where we can look at opportunities in our cornerstone industries and make them more innovative and more, adding more to the prosperity of Canada.
We're chatting tonight about innovation. We're chatting about the Canadian federal government that just got these mandate letters that are all the same for all these ministers, all focused on four main pillars. With Laurent Carbonneau, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Laurent in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. This will be an interesting conversation tonight where we talk about what's more important, sort of base industries, natural resources, or innovation. What can the government do to assist the growth of those industries? Have we been doing the right things in the past in regards to growing those industries? And what Laurent says, which is a little bit provocative, actually it's a lot provocative, is that the state of the Canadian economy today is in a state of emergency. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking about Canadian innovation tonight. We're talking about these mandate letters that have gone to the federal cabinet that, for the first time ever, it seems like they're all focused on the same thing rather than having separate policies for each one of them. And my guest, Laurent Carbonneau, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators, says that these are a good idea and that it will focus the ministers on the right things when he says that we're in regards to our economy, a state of emergency. And he quotes someone from the Bank of Canada who said it's a break the glass moment in regards to our level of productivity versus the United States. Laurent, as I mentioned, is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. He's got experience in Parliament Hill. He was working on national campaigns for the New Democratic Party. He has a master's degree from Carleton University in political management and also from the University of St. Andrews in history. And he's the author of, now this sounds really interesting, I got to talk to him about this, The Trough, The Rise and Rise of Canada's Corporate Welfare Bums. Sounds interesting. Laurent, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to keep chatting.
So, just off the top, if you could tell me, what the heck is the Council of Canadian Innovators?
Sure. So we're a business council that represents about 170 of Canada's fastest growing tech-oriented companies. That's we represent them sort of in terms of federal policy, in terms of policy in most of Canada's provinces. And we focus on addressing the barriers to scale up at a policy level, as well as giving them opportunities to network and collaborate with each other.
So I used to be in the pharmaceutical biotech space. And, the sense was that we did a reasonably good job in Canada of creating companies in that space, but we did a terrible job of growing those companies. And my company, like lots of companies, ended up going to New York to raise money and went on the NASDAQ or the NYSE or something like that. And the sense was that, we could get a little bit of money to start, but we couldn't get a lot of money to grow. And so therefore you had to be in New Jersey if you're in the pharmaceutical space, or Boston or Silicon Valley, or Raleigh, Durham if you were in the biotech space. Isn't that one of the big problems that we've got, is we just don't have risk capital that's willing to finance companies that are part of your organization?
That is absolutely a huge part of the problem. Yes. I think, the situation you've outlined is exactly why our organization exists. It's recognizing that, big picture, we need these companies to grow and grow in Canada if we want to be a successful and prosperous country that isn't just a branch plant economy for the next generation. So yes, that is absolutely one of the huge problems that companies are facing, is that, if you want scale up capital, growth capital, you're looking to the US. And there are places where, government can help with that. Of course, we have BDC, but also, frankly, we have a banking sector that's very sclerotic and risk averse and very protected, right? So this is one piece where pursuing a more competitive and integrated economy is a real asset. The other piece as well is, we have 13 separate provincial and territorial securities regulators. And, I think integration has gotten a little better in that space in the last couple of years with some changes there. But still, this is kind of like if you're a European or American investor, and even a Canadian investor, you're looking at like, oh boy, do I have to fill out, this paperwork 13 times across 13 different regulators if you want to operate there? It's tricky, right? So these are places where I think pursuing a more integrated economy, a more competitive banking sector, finance sector is going to help. And as well, frankly, when you're able to start generating these companies, and even, having exits in Canada, those folks can then reinvest in Canada, right? But it's really just getting this wheel started that we really have struggled over the last, 30 years, even the last 50 years to do in this country.
But it seemed like people were just more willing to invest in real estate or oil and gas in Canada, and that, just the regular person wasn't willing to invest in high tech or biotech.
Yeah, so the housing piece is, I think, a really important part of this, because you're totally right. People have, in Canada invested, tremendously into real estate, and it actually has been a real drag on the rest of the economy. Not just because, as you say, like people are investing in real estate instead of other things, but because then it actually makes the talent problem in Canada that much harder, right? In the modern innovation economy, a lot of the dynamism really rests on places that are really innovative and dynamic themselves, right? You're bringing together companies, you're bringing together universities. There's a lot of, intellectual energy. That's what makes Silicon Valley work now to some extent, right? Which, of course, I won't single out as a place with really affordable housing prices, but still. But if you look at Toronto or Kitchener-Waterloo or Montreal or places, Vancouver, certainly, places that are actually really innovative, they're really being held back by this. And that's exactly a good point, is I think we need to make other classes of assets much more attractive. And I think having a policy environment where we're telling innovators, this is a place where this country has your back, and we're going to be a customer. We're going to make sure that you're getting the talent you need. We're going to make sure the regulatory frameworks are, efficient while still protecting people. This would send, I think, a strong message.
So the first issue in these mandate letters was recognition that our weak productivity is a huge risk, and you've talked about that. Um, the productivity, I understand from comparison with the United States, is at like 40% of U.S. productivity, that we flatlined over the course of the last decade or so in growth in real median income. The United States has not. What's going wrong in productivity?
Yeah, so productivity it's in a bad state. And if you look since 2018, our productivity is flatlined. Like, it has not moved, barely grown at all. Which, that's now 7 years. That's a long time to have absolutely no productivity growth in labor productivity in the economy. It's pretty shocking. If you look globally, and we did this report last fall on sort of how governments can sort of help build more scale up firms, called Building Winners. One thing we found is that global productivity growth, if you look across all the OECD economies, pretty much, or let's say a disproportionate amount of productivity growth comes from big companies. So, once again, our answer to this is really that if governments are focused on creating scale up successes in Canada in the modern innovation economy, that's where we can get some productivity growth in kind of the medium term. I think in the short term, there's other places we can look. But if we're not fixing that big problem, that we're not growing these kinds of global companies in Canada, then we're really never going to make a lot of headway into solving this problem. And I should say, people often say, well, we're a small economy. We kind of are, by global standards, we're actually pretty big. We're just next to the biggest economy in the world. But if you look at places like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, South Korea, Singapore, these are all really innovative and productive economies, and they're not really big places. Finland is maybe about the size of Quebec. Sweden is not a whole ton bigger, maybe about the size of Ontario. So there's really, nothing holding us back here except for ourselves.
So why aren't we? We've got this, or at least for the last 7 years, we've had this free trade agreement with the United States. So we've been able to access a market that is 10
Yeah.
times our size. We've got innovative people. We've got supposedly some of the best universities in the world.
Yeah.
Why haven't we been able to increase our productivity? What has been holding us back?
Yeah, and you really hit the nail on the head earlier when you mentioned your own experience of your company having to leave for the US eventually because, at some level it's capital, at some level it's talent. I think this is a really stunning statistic that I learned not that long ago. It's that if you look at the world's biggest exporters of inventors, people with patents, top of the list is China, which, not too surprising, big country, a lot of inventors. Next is India, same thing, very big country, a lot of inventors. The third biggest exporter of inventors in the world is Canada, right? And that's, I think, a statistic that really should alarm us. And it's really borne out when you look more into the data on this. There was a study from Brock University in 2018 that found that it was like something like 3/4 of their software engineering grads were leaving for the U.S. at graduation. That's alarming, and 1/4 of all STEM grads. So brain drain is a big problem for us.
Hold it. 1/4 of all science, technology, engineering, and math grads were going to the U.S. Is that
This
right?
is from a survey from 2018, so I don't want to hang my hat too much on it, but it was a pretty high number. Yeah.
Sorry, from one university or from all universities?
I believe it was from a set of Southwestern Ontario universities. So you're testing my recollection of the study now, but it was a pretty alarming stat.
Mr. Carbonneau, that's shocking if it's 1/4. Like if you had said, 5-10%,
Yeah.
maybe I wouldn't have been surprised, but 1/4, that's
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Well, I mean, if you're a
If
young
we had
person in
lost
Canada,
1/4 of our
right?
doctors or 1/4 of our nurses, that would be
Yeah.
a healthcare crisis.
Absolutely. So, but I mean, this is exactly it, right? If you're a young person in Canada, and you graduate from university with, no strong family attachments, and you have the option of making, like in some cases, you're getting twice the salary and probably paying half the taxes. And perhaps cost of living is not as bad in wherever you might be looking in the US. It's not the case for everywhere. But the options are good, right? And people vote with their feet. And I think there's over 800,000 Canadians who live in the US. It's essentially a missing province, right, worth of people. And often these people are, some of the most entrepreneurial Canadians, and we lose them early and they don't come back. As a personal connection here, I actually grew up in the United States. My family moved there when I was 6 years old, and I moved back at 18. But it's because my family pursued opportunities there, and I still have family there, and that's the reality sometimes is that we lose people early and they don't come back, and it's a loss for Canada. And I think we really should be thinking very hard about how do we prevent this kind of brain drain, not by making it harder to leave, but how making Canada a more attractive place to build your career.
So it's interesting. I spent 5 years in the United States. I went down to the United States for my master's and stayed there for 5 years. And in my class, I can't quote everybody, but frankly, the majority of my class came back, not right away. One is president of one of Canada's largest grocery companies. One is president of a fairly sizable oil and gas investment bank. Another one is president of one of your competitors as one of the largest public policy think tanks. And I could go on. So, and then there's me. And then, a lot of people do go to the United States, get trained, get experience, but do come back. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I
No,
would argue that that's
yeah,
very beneficial.
it's a good thing. Yeah, absolutely.
So what do we got to do such that people either don't go or come back, or frankly, we attract some Americans here? What do we got to do to our economy?
Yeah, so this is one of the big pieces in the Mandate to Innovate report we just put out is really treating like the talent question as a head-to-head competition that we've been losing really, really badly for a long time. And we need to treat it like a head-to-head competition if we want to have any hope of winning, right? It's really like this is something we need to buckle down on. So there's a couple pieces to this. You mentioned bringing Americans and other people, frankly, from all over the world. And I think, there's a bit of an opportunity now. We have really good universities, as you mentioned. If we can attract early career researchers, I think that would be from all over the world who are, top of their fields. I think that would be a wonderful thing and would help. But, I think as you've mentioned, and we've kind of talked about, like having researchers to some extent and good universities is not really our national problem. It's having people who are entrepreneurs and who are building businesses. So to some extent, I actually think looking at how do we reach out to Canadians who live in the US now and say, hey, maybe this is the time to come home, right? And really make Canada look attractive. I think that takes a lot of things. We can look at how do we become more tax competitive. And there were both, commitments from both the Conservatives and the Liberals in the last campaign around this of how do we make investing in Canadian companies a more attractive proposition for the long term. The Conservatives ran on a sort of an abatement of capital gains. And the Liberals are proposing flow-through shares, both of which I think are fine ideas, well worth exploring further. But yeah, it's these tax questions to make Canada a more attractive place to grow a business, and these talent questions of how do we bring good people from all over the world and keep Canadians here. And I think if the government has a lens on both of those issues and is keeping them in mind as kind of complementary pieces they need to think about for this, I think we'll probably be able to find some good solutions.
So in the United States, there's this real anti-immigrant sentiment, which I fear has come to Canada to a certain extent, somewhat caused by the housing crisis and people blaming, students, foreign students, and other
Absolutely.
short-term foreign workers on contributing to the housing crisis. And so we've ratcheted back our immigration numbers fairly dramatically. Given what you've just said, is that smart? I just read that you probably read that the U.S. government is restricting Harvard University from accepting
Yeah.
students. I went to Harvard. I wouldn't be able to go for my education if I was granted the acceptance now, which would be a big shame
Yeah.
for me at least. And isn't this the time that we need to actually open up our immigration to smart people from the United States, from anywhere else in the world, if they've got those right credentials to come and contribute to our universities, contribute to our innovation? Aren't we doing exactly the wrong thing in our immigration attitudes right now to what we should be doing, particularly when our major competitor in the brain drain, the United States, is having this anti-immigrant flavor. And I go back to, studies that you could probably quote to me that say that the vast majority, something over 50% of all innovative companies in Silicon Valley were actually started by foreign students there on H-1 visas. So isn't this the time to say to those foreign students, come to Canada and start a business?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's part of the solution here. And I think it's just, for me, it's thinking beyond students, right? You mentioned the H-1B visa. A couple of years ago during the first Trump administration, we had in Canada a sort of very opportunistic policy that I think worked really well to say, hey, H-1B holders, come to Canada, and basically said, if you've been granted a US H-1B, you'll be granted sort of the equivalent Canadian, global talent stream visa, basically overnight. And that program was subscribed fully basically over the course of a weekend. It had been announced like on a Thursday or a Friday. So I think looking at those talent pools, absolutely. The global talent stream actually is something that CCI helped champion when it was first introduced 2017, 2018, a little bit before my time. But that's been a pretty big success for companies looking to bring in, really the best in their fields all over the world. This is, innovation sectors, it's really not, it's not a development league, right? You really do have to find the best people in the world. And this has been a really helpful tool. So that I think absolutely. To your broader point about kind of the rhetoric and discourse around immigration in this country, I think, it really does just come back to housing. People are so frustrated with the housing market. People are so frustrated with the cost of living. I understand that. It is pretty alarming. And if we're able to tackle the housing crisis and make that a priority and say to people like this is part of a grand bargain, we're going to bring in the best people in the world and we're going to tackle housing affordability, I think that can happen.
I interviewed an expert on immigration who did a major study in immigration, and she told me that 20% of immigrants to Canada actually leave within 5 years. And some of them return back to their home country, and often based on surveys because they didn't get a job or they weren't accepted or they didn't integrate. And then half of that half went on to the United States. So coming to Canada was like a stepping stone to getting into the United States. How do we combat that? How do we make sure the people that we bring here stay here and contribute long term?
I think there's no other answer for it than to make Canada the most attractive place to stay we can, right? There's just not really a shortcut there. It is fixing these problems. Obviously, I think any solution that's predicated on trying to keep people from leaving or keep people tied to a specific place, very rife for abuse and probably not something we want to do. I don't think there's much of an alternative there. And what you're describing is not a new phenomenon, right? This is kind of a tale as old as time for really the early 20th century onwards, when tons of people from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe came to Canada, and many of them went on to the US, many of them of course stayed. But yeah, these are this is not a problem you solve overnight. But recognizing that we do have to treat all of the above here as an emergency, that these productivity challenges, these brain drain challenges, the trade and security relationships, these are all really tied to each other. And if we're not investing in making Canada a modern, innovative economy that isn't just a branch plant, then we're not going to solve them.
We're chatting tonight about innovation in Canada. We're talking about the mandate letters that Prime Minister Carney has given to his new cabinet that have got five. I said four earlier. I made a mistake. It's five priorities, but it's the same priorities for all of them. It's recognizing that our weak productivity is a huge risk, strengthening Canada's strategic trade and security relationships, creating defense industrial policy and reinvesting in security, integrating Canada's economy and making it more competitive, and making Canada a global destination for top talent. We're chatting with Laurent Carbonneau, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. I'm going to ask him about defense policy. And, in the United States, defense policy, this military industrial complex, has been a huge catalyst to innovation in the United States. How do we make it so in Canada? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got a really interesting conversation tonight with Laurent Carbonneau, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. We're talking about these mandate letters that the federal government has provided to each one of the ministers that seem to be different, that they've got five priorities, all the same for all the ministers. Lauren, I got to ask you a question. One of the things that people have been sort of saying about the Trudeau era was that there wasn't a productivity growth orientation within cabinet, that there wasn't business people in cabinet. It was a whole bunch of lawyers and environmentalists in cabinet. And so therefore we sort of lost vision for the economy and how to grow the economy. This cabinet seems to be different. It seems like a guy that, I don't know whether he was a friend or just a business associate from Goldman Sachs and from the Bank of Canada has run in Thornhill, a newbie being appointed to cabinet and now in charge of, I think it's natural resources. And several other people seem to, have got real economic backgrounds, albeit Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition, is criticizing that it's the same as the Trudeau cabinet, or half of them are the same. What's your sense? Is this a different cabinet, more focused on the economy, more focused on productivity and prosperity, like some people think it needs to be and should be? Or is this just more of the same, just a retread of the Trudeau cabinet? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think it's a little early to say. Certainly some of the new names, I think strong, certainly strong indicators there. Certainly some surprises among returnees and surprises among people who didn't return. So I think it'll be a challenge for them to sort of figure out how they're going to work with this new prime minister, how they're going to focus on these new broad priorities that they've kind of been tasked with. And I think it'll also be very interesting to see how the public service, I think, responds to this kind of change. I think it's a bit of an under-discussed story, in Canadian politics. We don't talk much about the public service. I think people just sort of assume they show up for work, things tick along. But, it's a really dynamic institution in lots of ways that responds to, the political cycle has never been shorter. The demand for results from government has never been stronger. How are they responding to that? How are they going to respond to this new style? I think a really open question. So for me, it's a little too soon to say. I think certainly some promising indicators, and certainly on my end, I'm happy to work with government as much as we can on behalf of CCI to find places where we have common ground and help them look for good solutions. But yeah, it's early days, so I'm kind of reserving or withholding judgment on that for the moment.
Let me talk to you about defense, if I could,
Yeah.
for a couple of minutes, because that is one of the priorities that's been laid out. You mentioned it off the top. If we go to 2% of GDP being spent on national defense, and some people think that number is going to go up even potentially as soon as the G7 conference in June this year. We're going to ramp up our spending on defense dramatically. And some of it's, as we've been told, going to be just on people. There's no question we need to recruit more people within the Canadian military. But a lot of it's going to be on some pretty high-tech things, whether they be, guns or drones, like have taken off in importance, certainly in the Russian Ukraine war. But we're talking about these jets. We're talking about frigates. We're talking about NORAD, National North American Defense System. And on jets, it seems that we were going to be buying, or are going to be buying, jets that are going to be primarily produced in the United States. And I'm told that all the code is controlled in the United States. They can actually disable us if they so desire. That that all the maintenance is going to be in the United States, etc. And the jets that were the second choice were actually going to be produced in Europe and somewhat in Canada. And we were going to have complete control over all of the code and the maintenance. You think about the United States, a military industrial complex, if that's what is the right term, but they used military spending to spur innovation in a significant degree. Given all that, what do you think we need to do from an innovation standpoint in regards to this dramatic increase in defense spending, that if we follow the NATO mandates, we're going to have to spend?
Yeah, absolutely. So really good question. Couple of important pieces there. You mentioned, the role of government spending, and in particular defense procurement and research in driving innovation in the US. And I think that's a really important point to make. If you look at Silicon Valley, which people sort of now think of as like the software hub of the world, which of course it is. Historically, the reason that place is important is because of the semiconductor industry, the chips, after the end of the Second World War, when they were, basically the industry was created by Air Force, Navy, and other military procurement of these small chip companies that then became, Intel and others. And between, that sort of, and then the ball got rolling, and you had venture capital kind of develop around that hub, and it sort of became what it is today. But the seed of it was really this huge procurement of innovation effort. And I think this is something CCI spent a lot of time on last year, where we kind of somewhat tongue-in-cheek called 2024 the year of procurement, of how can government use procurement to stimulate innovation more. So I'll come back to that. But on the question of defense here in Canada, yeah, absolutely. Like we are going to have to spend, a lot to a lot more, depending on where things end up. And I think it really is going to be incumbent on us and incumbent on the government to think really hard about how are we going to spend that effectively. I think you look at places like the National Shipbuilding Strategy over the last 10 years, very little indication that money's been spent well. I think it might be really wise to not think so hard about how we're going to create a ton of jobs, though, that is important. But if we're treating this as a job creation strategy, I don't think it's going to work. I think if we're thinking hard about where do we create opportunities to not just meet our own needs, but also export to our allies, I think there we can maybe find some really interesting high value niches. So you mentioned drones. I think that's a really important one, just given Canada's own defense needs. We have, the Arctic, which is huge, very, very thinly inhabited. Drones absolutely are going to be part of the solution there. So, let's think really hard about what do our allies need? What do we need? How can we both, meet our own needs and then think hard about how can we adapt that to serving our allies, and be, basically winning export markets there. The other one is cybersecurity. Canada is really actually quite strong here. We have a lot of expertise here in Canada, a lot of good companies. That's going to be part of military and civilian security going forward. So let's think about that. And also, that's something that's very exportable already. We have a very competitive export industry there in Canada. So, how can we use procurement to sort of stimulate and grow that and grow big companies that are able to take that all over the world? Those are two, I think, really interesting niches. I think thinking beyond defense, though, this is kind of what we say in the context of procurement is that, the job of government is to solve problems that are hard to solve. And that there isn't, an immediately obvious lucrative market for solving, because otherwise someone would have solved it. So I think it's part of government's responsibility to think not just about how do we subsidize, how do we regulate, how do we tax? It's how do we create markets for things we want to see, right? And we look at, for instance, like the climate change space there. I think if you have really well functioning markets that government has structured in creating solutions around removing emissions, around preventing emissions, mitigating, and not just that, but you look at the housing crisis. How are we using our enormous forestry sector to meet our own needs? How are we sort of creating innovative construction materials, construction processes? A lot of there's a lot of discussion around modular. I think that's excellent. How do we pursue that? How do we feed the world? There's I think something like I'm misremembering this number here, but perhaps 90 million people, if not more, who are deeply malnourished across the world. Like that's a market. And how can government think about how can we use our existing strengths here to solve those by creating markets and then using the power of government to buy to solve them.
So a lot of what you've talked about is actually government getting more involved in the economy. One of the things that people have talked about a lot is actually the opposite, getting government out of regulating the economy. And some people have talked about that other mandate in regard to integrating the Canadian economy, that we've got to get out of all this duplicative regulation. I read a report this past weekend that in the housing sector, we don't have 13 economies. We've got hundreds of different economies because of zoning regulations between different municipalities. And sometimes the way those zoning regulations are implemented within even one city are different by different wards. And that's one of the reasons why the housing sector has a whole bunch of small companies, and particularly versus the United States, where it's big home builders that dominate. And our excessive regulation seems to be a problem. Isn't that sort of the opposite of what you're talking about?
So I'll separate those two conversations, because I do think you're absolutely right that we have a regulatory state that I think, I think a lot of this comes out of good intentions and good places from kind of the 70s onwards, but there's too much now, right? And there's never been enough effort to sort of look at what isn't working and what isn't needed and get that off the books. So like that's its own conversation, and I agree with you. This is really more about it's kind of the opposite. It's really about how do we create markets in solving problems that we need solved. And it's not stipulating exactly how we're going to do it. It's saying, here's the issue, here's the pot of money that's on the other end of it. Here's the size of that market. So let's get some innovative solutions rolling. and not worrying too much around, whether, they followed every single little piece. And this is something we've talked a lot about in the procurement areas, that this is exactly as you're describing. Every municipality, every province, the federal government, every department has different ways of doing it. It's so lawyered up that no one can get anything done, and it's a nightmare to buy anything more complicated than a pencil. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that. The regulation stuff, I think we do live in an overregulated economy. That said, I think if you look at, the world's most dynamic and innovative economies, it's not necessarily, zero regulation free market utopias on the one hand, and it's not, super regulated welfare states on the other. Though that said, you look at Singapore, you look at the Nordic countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, they're all actually really innovative. And I think it goes to show that it's kind of separate from the question of like, do you have too much or not enough regulation, but more about, are you governing well, and are you, taking into account the needs of your firms and your sectors and your economy?
This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with our guest, Laurent Carbonneau from the Canadian Council of Canadian Innovators, talking about these mandate letters, and more importantly than the mandate letters that have gone out to the cabinet ministers, innovation. And what do we have to do in Canada to get more of it? He's also written a book, The Trough, The Rise and Rise of Canada's Corporate Welfare Bums. Maybe we'll ask him about that just before we go. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've had a really interesting conversation with Laurent Carbonneau, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the Council of Canadian Innovators. You've written a book, The Trough, The Rise and Rise of Canada's Corporate Welfare Bums. Corporate welfare bums, that's something that it was, Stephen Lewis's uncle or whatever, 35 years ago that started talking about that, wasn't it?
Yep.
Like, why are you talking about corporate welfare bums now?
I've got David Lewis's book on my shelf, looking down at me right now. Yeah, no, it's So this is a book. It just came out from Sutherland House at the end of March, and available wherever fine books are sold. And yeah, it's a look back historically at how Canada has used, economic development policy, largely through the form of subsidies, to kind of pursue these national objectives. So there's a lot of overlap with my day job, it turns out. But it's more of a historical look, and we look a little bit at the present day as well. But yeah, no, it's fascinating. It was a really interesting book to research. You learned a lot about the railroads, about the national policy, about kind of how we built this big system of subsidies after the Second World War, how kind of all came crashing down in the 90s, and how we've rebuilt it very energetically over the last generation.
Sounds fascinating. We'll have to have you back to talk about it. This has been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed a lot of your policy ideas and thoughts. I got to tell you, it wasn't what I was expecting from a guy that's worked on NDP national campaigns. How do you fit? How does your political philosophy fit within the NDP?
Sure. So it's a good question. And I often these days I have my head in my hands a little bit. Obviously, the results of the election a couple of weeks ago were not so good for many of my friends, and I was very sad to see it. Look, like my view on this is I don't think the people running the country in Denmark, Sweden, Finland are all that crazy. And a lot of them are socialists, and they seem to do a pretty good job, but they also seem to have a very good understanding of why growth is important, why innovation is important. And they follow and they pursue those things. And I think the NDP has a challenge these days of seeing itself as more than just a party for how do we make the social welfare state stronger, which of course is a good thing in my view. But if there's no analysis of where are we getting the growth to pay for all of this, we run into real problems. And I think the election perhaps is a reflection of that.
Laurent Carbonneau, I really appreciate you joining us. I think these mandate letters are interesting. I do agree that I think having them all focused, all those cabinet ministers focused on a few things is very helpful. When I think about major companies that I've worked for, the ones where everyone's got different disparate objectives and policies, they haven't been overly successful. When the company has got a mission that everyone buys into and they know what they're trying to achieve, even though they've got different responsibility areas for achieving that, the companies are far better. I'm not sure if you can apply that to institutions like yours and or academic institutions, and it'll be interesting to see whether you can apply it to government. But I do think that it's a good policy, and I'm looking forward to it. I do think that this policy that he's announced in regards to making one Canadian economy by Canada Day, I think is the right thing. I moved from British Columbia to Ontario at one point in time, and I remember the moving company said you should go out and buy a bunch of wine because this is the one unique opportunity you've got to bring a whole bunch of great BC wine to Ontario and not have to pay all the extra tax for it. And I was going, I have to pay tax to bring wine from BC to Ontario, and you do. And so, bringing down those internal barriers to trade seemed to me to make a lot of sense. I love what you're talking about in regards to thinking about the war for talent as sort of a global competition, and that we've got to really go after the brain drain, but also more importantly, bringing back people that have gone outside of Canada and have got that expertise in education and experience, and attract them to come back to Canada, as well as the foreign immigrants that have got the opportunity to really contribute to our system. And then I think that this opportunity that we've got with the massive increase that we're going to have to incur in national defense spending needs to be seen as incredible opportunity, because we're being forced to spend it by things that we've signed with NATO and our allies. But we don't have to just spend it. We have to spend it in investing in areas that are going to grow our economy and grow employment, grow our intellectual property, grow those northern telecoms and Blackberries that you talked about at the top of the show, international, successful, innovative companies. And so I do think that we've got a huge opportunity right now. And I do think we've got this opportunity, particularly because our biggest competitor to the United States, to the south of the United States, is looking very inward, is becoming very insular, is becoming very protective. And I think they're going to make some big mistakes that we can take advantage of. And so I look forward to the role that you and your organization can play in writing really great analysis and spurring us to go the right direction. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on YouTube, on podcast servers, as soon as the radio show goes to broadcast. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Lauren.